Hello, thank you for joining my online presentation. I am delighted to participate in this conference, at least in this format. This is a very unusual format for me, so I hope everything works out. My name is Maksym Sviezhentsev. I am a historian. I completed my PhD in history at the University of Western Ontario just last year. I write about the history of early post-Soviet Crimea, and I apply post-colonial and settler colonial theories to that history. Today I'm going to talk about a broader topic, that is the application of post-colonial and settler colonial theory to the Northern Black Sea region. And I'm going to show how that theory can actually enrich our understanding of that region. I'm going to begin with the story of Musa Mahmud. On June 23rd, 1978, a Soviet police officer came to the house of a Crimean Tatar, Musa Mahmud, in Crimea in order to escort him to a meeting with a prosecutor. Mahmud was legally not allowed to live in Crimea due to his nationality, and in fact, he had just returned from prison where he served a sentence for illegally repatriating to his homeland just a few years prior. A meeting with the prosecutor meant that the government was not going to allow Mahmud and his family to remain in Crimea, and that there was going to be another criminal persecution. This time, however, Mahmud was not ready to surrender. He came out of the house with a box of matches and his clothes soaked in gasoline. The first match did not light up. After a second match, Mahmud was covered in flames of fire. He died 5 days later on June 28, 1975, and he was conscious the whole time and did not express any regret about what he did. The story of Musa Mahmud is one of many examples of the structural oppression that the Soviet regime used against the indigenous people of the Crimean Peninsula. Mahmud was persecuted by the state for being a Crimean Tatar in Crimea, for being a member of the national group that was not allowed to live on the peninsula, despite being indigenous to its land. This is also a story of resistance to the attempts of the state to marginalize and assimilate the indigenous population of Crimea, to mix it up with other peoples of the Soviet Union, and to erase the very presence of Crimean Tatar culture in history on Crimean soil. The story of Musa Mahmud demonstrates that there are social and political processes in the history of Crimea that are omitted or ignored by the dominant narrative of Crimean history. The way I'm trying to explain those social and political processes and write them back into history is by applying settler colonial theory. I use it to highlight the cultural, political, and demographic processes that forged the Russian Crimea and marginalized every alternative vision about the peninsula's past and present. Settler colonialism is a type of a foreign invasion, which, according to Patrick Wolf, involves a range of practices that aim to marginalize and eliminate the indigenous people and their cultures on the colonized land in order to replace them with settlers. Colonizers claim the land and forge the so-called settler's myth, which is there to justify the colonization and the violence against the colonized. The logic of settler colonial project, according to Patrick Wolf, is, quote, a sustained institutional tendency to eliminate the indigenous population. The concept of settler colonization traditionally applies to the history of Western European colonization of North America, Australia, Africa, and Asia. In effect, the process of settler colonization involves a so-called civilizational project that is meant to create a new society in the colonized space. And by creating a new society, settler colonization changes all spheres of life of the colonized people and the space itself. All settler colonial projects narrow down to the replacement of the indigenous population of the colonized territory with settlers. This can happen in a form of cultural, political, racial, religious marginalization, policing of indigenous bodies, displacement, assimilation. Settler colonialism often has a strong racial and ideological component to it, since the empire needs a justification for the erasure of the indigenous peoples. Therefore, the indigenous are often proclaimed as inferior or backward or aggressive, uncivilized, racially inferior, and it becomes the empire's duty to civilize them through assimilation or prolonged genocide. Think of a classic American literature and cinema and the whole cultural industry that describes the United States expulsion into the Wild West. And the way those cultural products describe the Indians. The indigenous people in those stories are usually perceived as backward and aggressive, while the white American man become paragons of manliness and civilization and courage in that story. In the history of Crimea, the pattern of myth-making is very similar. The deportation of Crimean Tatars was part of a continuous process of the imperial policy of settler colonization in Crimea that started with the annexation of the Crimean Khanate in 1783. Over the next 2 centuries, as you can see on this graph, the imperial policies either caused or stimulated immigration or forcefully deported the Crimean Tatar population from the peninsula, while gradually settling this territory with Slavic people. Crimean Tatars were repeatedly stigmatized for their religion and accused of treason, first during the Crimean War of 1853-1856, and then after the Second World War in 1944. They were not, in 1944, Crimean Tatars were completely deported from Crimea to Central Asia and not allowed to return. They were deprived of their very name. No official document referred to them as Crimean Tatars, but only as Tatars. And because they lost their names, there could be no Crimean Tatar language in schools or institutionalized Crimean Tatar culture. Apparently, Crimean Tatar people were supposed to blend with Tatars of Kazan, assimilate among other Muslims of Central Asia and Soviet Union, and forget about their origin. Crimea was not the only space that was colonized in late 18th century. As a result of the annexation of Crimean Khanate, the vast steppe to the north of Crimea, I'm showing it to you on the screen right now, was colonized as well. The steppe also became of settler colonization. The plot of the novel Dead Souls by Nikolai Gogol, or Mykola Gogol in Ukrainian, reflects the history of what is now the southern Ukraine, the North Black Sea region. According to the plot, an adventurous man invented what we now would call a corruption scheme. He legally purchased serfs who were already in fact dead, but had not been registered as dead. He needed those dead serfs in order to get free land in the steppe to the north from Crimea. This land was considered empty, and the imperial authorities actively invited settlers to colonize it. Now, on your screen, you have 2 maps. One shows, the map on the left shows the region before the annexation of the Crimean Khanate. So here we see the Ottoman Empire, and this region is also settled by what is here shown as Tatars. Now, the map on the right shows the same region after the annexation of Crimea, and this land now is part of the Russian Empire of Tavrida Governorate, which is the steppe to the north of Crimea and Crimea itself. Calling the land empty prior to colonizing it is common, for example, for British settler colonialism. According to the views of British colonists of the 19th century, the land that was not developed, plowed, was considered wasted and belonging to no one. Since many indigenous people of North America were nomadic, colonists simply did not consider them enough of humans, civilized enough to consider their land as taken. The steppe of the southern Ukraine wasn't empty as well. Traditionally, it was home to nomadic people, Nogai Tatars. The settlement of the Ukrainian steppe described by Gogol was in fact settler colonization. It was only possible as a result of replacement of the Nogai population of the settled area. However, historical narrative and cultural image record this area as empty and available for resettlement. In order to make Crimea properly Russian, and in order to make the region north of Crimea Russian, it was important to create a historical narrative for it. The old history, culture, geographical names, and even a physical space of Crimea had to be reshaped and reimagined into the new construct, a new imperial construct. During the period of the Russian Empire, it was Crimea became a garden of Catherine II and other emperors of the Russian Empire. During the Soviet period, Crimea was turned into the all-Soviet resort for the communist nomenclatura. As a result of the Russian and Soviet settler colonization of Crimea, the peninsula received a smooth historical narrative, which was an extension of the Russian historical narrative. It resulted in a creation of a myth according to which the Russian Empire peacefully incorporated the peninsula without disturbing the life of local population and brought culture and civilization to this land. Further history that concerns periods after 1783 talks little about the indigenous population of Crimea and becomes mostly the history of Russia in Crimea. Crimean Tatars appear in that history occasionally and mostly as a side story or as villains, like, for example, during the Second World War, when the whole nation was falsely accused of treason and deported. The application of settler colonial theory allows to challenge the Russian and Soviet imperial myth of the history of Crimea. It shows that the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union practiced a number of policies that were similar to Western settler colonialism. The empire settled the land, removed or marginalized the indigenous people and their cultures, claimed the land, and wrote a new history that justified its control in the colony. Eventually, just like in British settler colonies, settlers and their children in Crimea developed their own local identity. However, Russian and Soviet settler colonialism in Crimea does have some unique features that make it that make it different from settler colonies of the West. The expansion of the Russian Empire to the northern Black Sea region did not involve the creation of formal colonies that were separated from metropole by sea. Therefore, unlike British colonialism, the Russian Empire did not have a clear measure between the metropole and its colonies. Neither did the imperial authorities create a clear line between the colonizers and the colonized. Crimean Tatars were stigmatized for their religion and orientalized for their cultural differences, but at least in the earlier stages of colonization, the empire aimed to incorporate Crimean Tatar elites into the imperial elites, which is not common for the Western European colonialism. There is an extensive debate about the application and measures of application of racial uh, histories to the history of Eastern Europe and Russian imperial history and Soviet imperial history. I'm not going to go very deep into that, but sorry, what I am going to say is, unlike the history of Western racism, the racial dynamic here was less formal and functioned as a discursive practice. Therefore, racial dynamic is present with the history of Crimean Tatars, of course, and by the way, it is still present in Crimea when we talk about Crimean Tatars, but the measures and the dimension of that racial dynamic is different and less formal than in the history of Western racism. Crimean settler colony continued its existence after the fall of the USSR, and the fact that it appeared under a sovereignty of a different state, Ukraine, makes for another uniqueness unique feature of this settler colony. The settler colonial institutions that made the settler colony survived, and therefore there was no decolonization in Crimea. The structure of the Crimean autonomy was, in fact, a way for the Crimean settler colonies to adapt to the fall of the empire. This Crimean autonomy discriminated against the indigenous Crimean Tatars, not to mention Ukrainians, who of course are not indigenous to Crimean land, and protected the settler institutions and their political elites from the Ukrainian influence. Therefore, the fall of the USSR did not bring the immediate decolonization, but only a slight change to the composition of a settler colony. When the Russian army occupied and annexed the peninsula in 2014, we could see another iteration of revitalization of a Russian settler colonial project. In fact, since 2014, Russian settler colonial project resumed in full scale. Since that time, Russian authorities gradually push away Crimean Tatar and Ukrainian population out of Crimea and replace it with settlers. Since 2014, Russia, according to different estimates, moved to Crimea between 500,000 and 1 million people. So today, roughly 1 out of 3 people in Crimea came to Crimea from Russia after 2014, so over the last 7 to 8 years. The fact that Vladimir Putin in 2014 appealed to the history of Novorossiya, you can see it in yellow on this map, is another interesting reiteration of the Russian imperial history. This Novorossiya is exactly the territory that was colonized, settler colonized in the 19th century. And the fact that Russian president used that history, that imperial history, for the new geopolitical aggression and military aggression demonstrates that settler colonialism as an analytical tool becomes very valuable for understanding of the history of the region today. Thank you for this presentation. Thank you for listening to this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. If you would like to contact me, you can always email me. Here is an email on your screen, and you can always tweet at me. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. I would be Very happy to hear any feedback if that's possible. And please have a good day, everyone. Bye.